First, thank you so much for this deeply personal documentary. I'm Bea Bodrogi and I will be moderating this Q&A tonight. I'm a human rights lawyer here in Hungary. First, I would like to ask you about your identity, and because I was thinking about how to introduce you, because you appear as Lina everywhere, and we don't know much about you. When watching the film, I fully understand that you needed this to cover your identity. Do you still need to cover your identity?
The main reason for which I still need to cover my identity has a lot more to do with the rest of the characters of the film. We are trying our best to protect the anonymity of other characters in the film, and the less that is known about me, then the lower the odds are that that will lead to someone, concluding who they might be. As well, I'm not really hiding in the sense that you see my face, but it's just about making it a bit harder for anyone that is trying to trace who these characters are, to force them to do a bit more work, and also to avoid overlap of, It's a bit complicated how we do the security calculation, because it also has to do with how well we guess the way the regime works. Because this is not according to law, there are no clear procedures. It's based on previous experience of how we know they operate. So it's all about, best possible guess. And, after discussing with the producers and with the characters and everyone, we decided this is going to be the strategy we use.
Just staying in this context, can you tell us what the situation is in Syria now? Why do you need to remain in anonymity? And your friends, as far as I understand, 2 of your friends stayed in Syria. Are they safe enough? What do we need to know here about Syria in this sense?
So Assad is still in full control. Not full control. There are still parts of the territory that are under rebel control, not under his army's control. But in Damascus, for instance, where our protagonists are, Assad is back in full control, which means that the security risk for them continues. There are still hundreds of thousands of detainees incommunicados for over a decade now, if not more. Arbitrary detention continues, death under torture continues, so it is very important that we still maintain anonymity of the characters. A lot of the characters chose to leave or are no longer with us to begin with. Some of the characters have left but still can go back and visit. They have family they would like to still be able to visit, so that was also a consideration. In terms of what the country in general is like, it's in shambles, basically, the whole, and I'm not talking about necessarily areas outside of the regime control or neighborhoods that were shelled. I'm talking about the infrastructure of the entire country. I'm talking about even before COVID, about 70% of all healthcare professionals had left the country. We used to be a country that exports petroleum. Last year, because of lack of gasoline, there was an official holiday declared because the government couldn't provide enough gasoline for public transport to work so that employees can go to their offices. This is how bad the collapse is. The currency right now is worth less than 1% of its original value. The percentage of people living under poverty line has never been this high in the country before. We now have people going hungry in even the capital. This is not something we've, because Syria has always been an agricultural country. Food was never really a question. It was very cheap always because it was locally produced. but the attack on the environment and the price that a lot of the rural areas had to pay, all the farmers that were displaced, meant that we no longer have any kind of food security and we need to import food. So in general, the country, regardless of politics pro or with Assad, is in a state of, basically it's a failed state by now. It's a failed state. It's going downwards. Nobody knows how it can possibly climb back up. Nobody knows what an exit is, but as long as you're good enough to answer Russia and China, you can get some loans, and that will keep you popped up until it goes.
Thank you. Just to let you know that I prepared with few questions, but after 10 or 15 minutes, I'm happy to give the floor to you. So raise your hand if you would like to join and ask questions. And let's turn to your film. I was very impressed because it's not only about your personal story, it's also about your brave journalism, video journalism. So how could you manage to balance and to navigate with these parts, your personal parts and your journalistic parts, if you had that two parts?
I didn't balance, it was total chaos. Okay. I don't know if I conveyed the wrong impression here.
I mean, I could see, we all could see that you had different identities, different names. I took notes how many names you had in which city. But by the end, I thought that, you were still in the story and also as a journalist being objective and not objective.
So what we watched was 90 minutes, but it was shot over a period of 4 to 5 years. So it's a lot easier to create order in the chaos when you're only selecting 90 minutes, and it also you need it because you need to help people understand.
How many hours did you have?
Did not count. I did not. No, I mean, I didn't count hours. I just know that I developed the carpal tunnel syndrome, which is where you're basically your wrist becomes almost permanently in a state of infection because of carrying the camera for so long. At one point, it just became part of my hand, and it was like compulsive. I couldn't put it down. I was using more than one camera. I changed memory card, changed battery, back on, because there was no telling what's going to happen next, and it can happen at any minute. I mean, one night you're just, relaxing at home, sitting with a cat, coloring or whatever it is that you're doing, and the bomb falls just right out your window. I happened to have been filming the cat in that moment, and I caught it on camera. So many other very important moments passed when I wasn't filming, of course. So you just keep shooting and hoping that you will react in the right moment, in the right place.
Anything on this personal and journalistic part you would like to add or explore?
So it was, in the film, it wasn't just personal journalistic, but it was also the third character was the director. So there was the friend, the activist, there was the journalist, and also the director. And it took quite some time to develop the voiceover, the narration, because of that, because it had lots of roles to play. In a sense, it had many functions, and it was trying to put together all the different layers and create some sort of coherence between them. So the voiceover was the last thing that we developed after we finished the first cut. We started writing the voiceover, and then based on what we write, we would go back and visit the scene and feel that, okay, we can change a few things here now that the voiceover is saying this and that. And bit by bit, between writing and re-editing, is how we finally reached the final cut.
When you say we, Who are they?
Me and my many editors, I changed 7 editors in the process of making the film. But it was mainly, the main 2 editors were the rough cut editor, which is Bodrogi in Berlin, that we were editing there, and then the final cut editor, which is Diana, who is also my producer.
And during these 4 years' time, 2011 and 15, you did everything on your own. You mean filming and in a way directing as well?
Yes, because, well, number one, the security situation did not allow for an entire crew to be around and moving. It was too much of a risk. And also the type of relationship I had with the characters didn't allow to bring an outsider into the room with us because it was just going to change the dynamic so much. And it's just the type of film that it is, this sort of immersive experience. If you have an entire crew with you in the room, yeah, I don't think it would have worked.
No, I didn't mean that, having an entire crew in those days or years. I meant maybe one of the characters or your friends were part of filming, directing.
No, they were not, because already it was, they were really pushing their limits in a sense to even accept to have all of this documented and kept on hard disks that can be at one moment found
for security
reasons.
For security reasons. And not for you filming them and you as a group.
No, I mean, different characters in the film had different preferences, so some of them were very excited about it, some of them were a bit shy, you know, as always on any set. But it was mainly the security considerations that made it quite a sensitive topic. So I was doing my best to save them the headache of having to calculate and reconsider all the time. I was just always being extra careful with encryptions, with passwords, with how well I would delete copies and all of that. So even when I was arrested, none of my, even though, I mean, some of the times when I was arrested with my camera and my footage, but they were not able to access them because of the way I would encrypt and hide the material.
None of them have been taken away at all.
No. And I think that trust I earned from the characters by them watching how I was dealing with the footage and the cameras, and I don't know if they would have trusted a third party as much with that as well. I mean, it's just when you're really literally risking your life with someone, the level of trust you need to have with them is not something that works on a more professional basis of recruiting crew, you know? It's not how it works.
On the personal level, when editing or directing the film years later, or I don't know how many years it took.
In 2011, we released it earlier this year in January, so 11 years.
Wow. Did you involve them, the characters, when editing? What to cut off, what to involve?
We were always,
how did it go?
Yeah, so the discussion about what we should include and what we should not include was always on the table, even when we were still shooting. So there were moments where they would tell me, don't shoot this, stop the camera. Or moments when even after I shoot something, they feel bad about it and they go back and tell me, you know what, maybe you can keep this out. And of course there's a very thin line there between, you know, people's right to privacy and what they would like to share and not share with you, and making sure it doesn't cross over to become a sort of censorship also. But I think at the moment these were not the concerns they were having, and most of the concerns were either related to security or related to really, really personal issues. So at one point, Susu's mother was a character in the film, and they were, for me, some amazing moments of them fighting and then making up, and then they had a very interesting dynamic between them, and her mother passed away afterwards. So I know that the footage related to her mother would have been very sensitive, and I would have definitely, you know, given her the lead on deciding what is the right way to represent her. But for various other reasons, we ended up not including her in the final cut to begin with. So that was an instance where we didn't need to consult so much. But the characters watched the film after the final cut was made and before we finished the final touch-ups, and there were a few requests here and there that they had preferences about that we were able to accommodate, so that worked out well. But it didn't involve them in the editing of the story per se, also because it is not easy for them to watch the film. And it was not easy for me to watch the footage, and it was not easy for me to edit the film. And that was something I felt I owe them to spare them from it. Because they had already risked so much and given me so much and allowing me to film them. I didn't want to lay that burden on them as well. So I waited until I had a clean cut, and then I showed it.
Turning to my last question so that I can pass the floor to the audience. In one of your interviews, you said that you were motivated to make a film about the change, or about change, or making change. What do you mean under that? What do you mean under change in regard with your film?
So change was happening with or without us. We were just trying to influence it, and we were trying to, hopefully push it away from total disaster and into something positive and productive. Probably we weren't very successful, but I think, I know from talking to the characters, none of them regret having participated or having tried. A lot of us had years of guilt and struggle in thinking, what did we do wrong? What else should have we done that might have prevented this? There was a lot of self-blaming and a lot of, at one point you have to think, it was either my fault and I take responsibility, or there was nothing I could have done about it, and then you feel completely useless. And you are faced with this dilemma of, am I guilty or am I useless? And it's not a very nice spot to be in. But it is a natural part of the process of change when change is this huge. And I think that is the experience I wanted to share. Nobody knows where Syria is heading from here. We always try to be hopeful that eventually, sooner or later, things will get better. Even if they do, I think everyone agrees that the price we've had to pay is absolutely outrageous and should not be like that at all. But there are moments in time in history when things will happen, and you either join them and do your best, or you will always feel both guilty and useless.
At the end of the film, you said that you are not going to report about Syria anymore. Can you keep that?
You mean, is it a promise? No, it's not a promise. It was just the decision that I made at one point, and that was around COVID time, so not so long ago. And it mainly had to do with the fact that nobody was listening anymore. So I was taking huge risks. The people I was working with The people that were talking to me, the people I was filming were taking huge risks. The people that were trying to put the work together, to find funds, to support websites, to produce articles, so on and so forth. Everybody was extremely stressed, and in the end, everybody was just bored of us. Nobody was following the news anymore, and I felt like, of course, not to compare at all the scale of what is still happening in Syria to the scale of what is happening in Gaza in any way, shape, or form. But there are these, media trends where one news item covers up everything else or shadows over everything else. So for instance, this month, the northern part of Syria that is still under rebel health control was under the strongest shelling it had witnessed in years. Israel shelled both of our international airports, and now they are out of order. Attacks in southern Lebanon have killed dozens of people. The crisis in Congo, the crisis in Sudan, it's not just Syria. There are trends in news, and the way the industry is shaped and the way the companies work and the financing model works is that news is merged with entertainment. By definition, news has to be new. So if you keep getting killed for 10 years by the same dictator, eventually people will get bored of your death. It's horrible to say, but it's a fact.
Yeah, I think we all know that feeling. Not that extent, but yeah.
So I think at one point I started feeling like I was reporting, number one, because I knew people, some people at least, wanted their voices to be heard and wanted to make sure that what is happening to them does not go undocumented. But there were also lots of people that were really just sick and tired of taking a risk on themselves by talking to me for nothing. So I felt at some point, that I was almost doing more harm than good. If no help to these people is gonna come from the risk they are taking, then why am I putting them in that position? When we first started, this is part of the reason also why I opened talking about the Hama massacre of '82, because the ability of the regime to censor media and coverage and information back then was so complete, to the extent that we do not, and I've looked for years for any visual documentation of that massacre. The shelling continued for 3 weeks. Those killed are estimated somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people in 3 weeks. Hundreds of thousands that were detained incommunicado for decades after that. And at one point, I always mention this because it was so sobering. I was visiting some old neighbors from that city, and I saw a black and white photo, an old photo up on the wall of a very old neighborhood with the old city walls and a castle-like structure. It looked a bit like old Prague, overlooking the famous river of Hama. And I knew the river, obviously, and I've been to that city before, but I've never seen anything like this there. So I asked them where that was, and they said that this is the Keilani neighborhood in Hama, which is now a park. It's grass. So the only actual evidence we have is just the before and after. And I think that was part of the reason why everyone in Syria, the moment all of this started, everyone's reaction was, film this. We will not let this go without documentation this time. So when I started going to homes at the beginning, the guy that would show me the marks on his head, and I wasn't planning, I didn't look for him, I was just walking in the the street, he saw my camera and he walked up to me. Everybody wanted us to film. They would take us from one place. It was impossible to plan a shooting day there because everyone's just literally grabbing us by the hand and taking us to show us something and say, film this, shoot this, I want the world to see this. 2 years later, I was in the suburbs of Homs giving a training to local media activists there on video reporting, and even the local young activists were getting in trouble with their neighbors that did not want them to document the shelling on the village school. Because if they upload a video about what the regime was doing on YouTube, the regime will shell the village again as punishment. Whereas no one in the world is intervening to help, so what is the point? So in 2 years we went to that total flip in the faith in journalism and in cameras and documenting. And up until, I think, the war in Ukraine, the Syrian war was, until that point, the best documented war in history, also in part because of the digital technology and the internet. And still, I mean, it didn't do much help. So, on the one hand, as a journalist, at least I feel, okay, to a certain extent, we've done our field work well. But then the rest of the work that has to do with the lobbying, with the creating media institutions, with changing the global narrative, the geopolitical priorities over human suffering, I still think we all have a lot of work to do in that regard.
I fully agree. Thank you. We have some minutes left for questions.
Thank you so much for making the film and for sharing it with us. Can you talk a little bit about the collaboration with Lara Poitras and Dara Joe?
So I first met Laura in ITFA in 2011. We had started working on the film along with some other projects, and she was giving us a kind of coaching session. And she was always in connection with Docsfox, which was the local documentary film festival in Damascus, which was initially created by the company that Diana had founded, Pro Action Film. And I was already working with Diana on the film. She was the producer back in Damascus. And I had met her, I mean, I worked with her before during Docsfox as well in previous editions in previous years. So so that was the first contact, and then, you know, back and forth over the years we would sometimes touch base again and talk a bit about the progression of the work, but it wasn't until the final cut was locked that we met again, and the decision was made that she would come on board of the team. The work with Diana has been almost a lifelong partnership by now, since 2011. And yeah, as you also know, she was the producer throughout this phase, but also she was the editor of the final cut of the film. So yeah, we shared quite a lot. There are no wrong questions.
My name is Verzió, and I would like to. I have two subjects and two questions actually. One of them is that it's well known that Russian politics was participating in the Syrian events, and I think that the Russian support played an important role in the success of Assad. This is one thing, so that if you could say some words very shortly about this subject. And the other thing is that there were very many Syrian refugees who arrived in Hungary. Hungary, that time, in the end of the last years of the 80s, like to mention that Hungary was the first former communist country which joined the Geneva Agreement, and as the behavior against the Syrian refugees was absolutely against the spirit of the Geneva Agreement, and only civilian organizations and civilian people were helping the Syrian refugees, and the government did not too much. And there was a very ugly propaganda against asylum seekers and refugees. And as far as I know, practically all refugees left Hungary.
So the Russian involvement, Russia had already been a long-time ally of the Assad regime, but it was not as heavily involved as it became during the war. Personally, I left Syria when the Russians came in. That was when it became a bit too hard to keep up. Even for practical reasons, like for instance the security apparatus online became way harder to navigate through with the help of Russian hackers and Russian online security and digital experts. From what I saw in traveling around Syria, Russians were happy to directly or indirectly sell weapons to both sides of the conflict, and I don't think it's the first time they do it. Apart from that, I'm not a geopolitical analyst, but everybody knows that Russia always needs some sort of access to the Mediterranean, and Syria is always kind of its share, because the southern part was more Israeli-American influence, and Turkey is a bit harder to crack than Syria. But I think before Assad becoming this weak under the pressure of the revolution, he would not have needed to succumb so much to Russian influence, as he ended up doing eventually. I mean, he basically, the only card he had in his hand to pretend to have some sort of military autonomy were the chemical weapons, and he had to get those out in order to stay in power. One of our two main ports has been rented out to Russia for 99 years, for peanuts basically. At one point there was a shadow Russian minister in every ministry telling each and every minister how to manage the country. Vetoes, I mean, I think Russians broke the veto record for Assad's sake. But then again, the region's history with vetoes, whether Russian or American, it's just a joke. And in terms of Syrian refugees in Hungary, I don't know a lot, to be honest, because Syrians were just everywhere at some point. I couldn't, keep them up very clearly about how it is where. But I do remember at one point, and I think around 2015, when I started having to go to Berlin for editing, one of the technical assistants with us on the crew was very excited about working on the film because he wanted to do something in support to Syrians. And at first I didn't really get it, because I was so preoccupied with what is happening in Syria, what we were trying to do. It was not so much a priority for me to see how a German was seeing a Syrian that had arrived there. But, I was hearing in the media all the talk about the refugee crisis, and I thought, these have to be, right-wing extremists that are calling crisis. I mean, at that point, there had not been yet not even 1 million Syrian refugees arriving in the whole of Europe. Syria alone, which is a country of 20 million, had already been hosting 1 million Iraqi refugees for about 8 years. Lebanon, a country of 4 million population, had been hosting 2 million additional Syrian refugees. So our concept of what a refugee crisis is very different. So at first I wasn't really taking it seriously, and then, you know, bit by bit it became really a concrete, very important factor in any political agenda and any political party in Europe. And I was like, wow, that is mind-blowing. But that's how politics work, you know, whatever is trendy, you pull it out and you work with it and you make use of it. So I absolutely agree with you that when it comes to real solidarity, it's always civil society, it's always individuals, it's always grassroots. And I think part of the change that is important to work on is to make sure that our political representatives, you know, whether in a dictatorship or in democracies, are a bit more representative of the society. You know, I mean, and the events we're seeing unfolding now in Palestine are the same. You have, you know, millions of people taking to the streets calling for a ceasefire, and others are saying, well, you know, we should look at it.
Yeah. This is why I asked about change, you know, what you mean under change and how we define. I think we could talk about this for hours. But if you don't, do you have any question? If not, then I close it here. And thank you so much for your film and for you coming to Budapest and taking part in this festival.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and thank you for everyone that came and stayed for the Q&A. And yes, I'm very happy that I made it finally to the festival, and I'm also looking forward to watching some of the other films because it's a great program that they've put together.